Hello and welcome to the Craft Beer Corner. For today's beer review, we're jumping into a couple of IPAs. Nothing fancy, just standard IPAs. One of these is from a brewer I've never had anything from before, so that's always exciting. One I've had a few beers from. I've enjoyed all of them, so gonna see what their IPAs are about. So we're going to be starting today with New Image Brewing. This one's called Bio-T. It's an IPA, clocks in at 6.5% ABV. They are based in Arvada, Colorado. For number two, we're jumping over to a collaborative beer brewed between Fort George Brewing and Grains of Wrath Brewing. This one is called Fanzine. It clocks in at 6.7%, and Fort George is based in Astoria, Oregon. So both of these kind of on the western side of the United States. One, I think the first IPA I've had from the brewer, one brand new to me, and some other information which we'll get into, but always exciting. So we're going to get this kicked off, starting with the New Image Brewing Bio-T that clocks in at 6.5% ABV. Okay, so jumping into the first beer of today's IPA review, we have got New Image Brewing's Bio-T. This is an IPA that clocks in at 6.5% ABV. They are based in Arvada, Colorado. Now, Bio-T, kind of an interesting name, but it's also a bit of an interesting beer. This is brewed with a new experimental hop named Bio-T, so they named it after that. Indeed, on the front, it does say experimental hop India Pale Ale. So has one experimental hop, Bio-T, and then they paired that with Citra and Motueka hops as well. So Citra, Motueka, we know are going to be pretty big, bold, pungent hops that are going to add a lot of different elements to the beer. But I'm very keen to see what this new Bio-T hop brings to the table. So let's check out this label here. It's kind of an 8-bit, almost Minecraft-looking picture of a hop. Looks really neat, but nothing more to talk about. So let's get this cracked and poured right in the glass. Gently, gently. All right. It's a nice looking IPA. I can smell it from here. It's very pronounced aroma. Nice classic yellow, proper golden hue to it, forming a nice head. I'm going to let that do its thing. We didn't quite get the whole beer in there, but that's all right. Yeah, visually, it's a little cloudy. It's hazy-ish, though I'm not sure if they brewed it intentionally to be a hazy, but it does have a little bit of occlusion to it. Not over the top. Doesn't look as thick and cloudy as a milkshake IPA, for instance, but there's a little bit of that. True, very bright, classic IPA yellow color. Obviously did form a very nice head here. Seems to be pretty effervescent. The bubbles I can see sticking on the glass are just kind of really fine, tight ones. So we'll see how long this head holds up, but right now, looks like it poured great. Let's give it a sniff right over the glass. Oh yeah. Oh, that smells really nice. Okay, so there's a lot of aromas that I'm getting out of this, and it's kind of all over the board. I'm getting a little bit of pine. That's not the dominant, but I am picking up on it. There's also definitely an earthy quality to it, and I'm getting tons of citrus, tons of fruit, specifically kind of melons. I'm getting cantaloupe and kind of citrus rind kind of aroma that goes with that. Even a little bit of a grassy smell. So it's kind of got a little bit of everything in there in terms of aroma. And it's very pungent. You don't even have to get right up over the glass. I could smell it as I was pouring it. But yeah, it smells really nice. It smells very fresh. Head settled down a bit there, so let's jump right in. Ah, that's a nice IPA. That's a very nice IPA. Now, in terms of what I think this experimental hop is bringing to the table, it's got an interesting blend. See, Citra, if it's adding some elements that both Citra and Motueka are bringing to the table, it's a little hard to discern because they're big and bold and pungent. So Citra obviously is known for very big, bold, citrus-like aromas as well as flavors, and that's coming through clearly. It also does give a little bit of that resinous piney back to it. Motueka can have a lot of different fruits, some tropical fruit. It could also add, obviously, the melon, and it does tend to have a little bit of that earthiness. Those are kind of the dominant traits. But there's something else in here, and I can't quite put my finger on it. Got a lot of different aromas, but there's a flavor in here that's a little hard to pin. It almost reminds me of that Kveik yeast beer that we reviewed an episode or two ago, with this interesting, it's almost, I don't want to say it tastes like there's Brettanomyces in here, but it's got this very interesting flavor profile that's coming through in the beer, and it's really quite nice. It's unique and it's interesting, so I have to assume that's the Bio-T. I've had plenty of beers with Citra and Motueka. I'm just going to start calling it that pronunciation from now on. I don't know how it's pronounced. If anybody does know, please tell me in the comments so I can get it right. But at any rate, yeah, Bio-T. Interesting new hop. Pairs well with these two, to be certain. So I'm going to jump back in to analyze this flavor a bit more. Think on the body and mouthfeel. Body on this one is a solid medium. The mouthfeel on this one feels like a classic IPA, though I gotta say, there's a lot more resistance here than your average IPA. Certainly for 6.5, that's not ridiculously high ABV for an IPA, but there really is a lot of resistance to the mouthfeel on this one. The mouthfeel is definitely a lot more impressive than the body. The body feels about where I would expect for this ABV range, but that's an impressive mouthfeel. There's a ton of resistance here. Agitating around the palate, it does get a little thicker, but it doesn't get what I would term creamy. In terms of hop intensity, the flavors are really the big ones here. It's kind of mixes of everything that you got in the aroma. There's a little underlying bit of bitters, but it's not one that I would say is very, very bitter. Somebody that's just getting into IPAs likes IPAs that kind of accentuate the hop aroma and flavor elements outside of the bitter realm. This is one I would definitely recommend to you because it's not over the top in terms of at least perceived bitterness or IBUs. Tastes very, very nice though. I've got to emphasize just how fresh this beer tastes. Honestly, I don't know when they canned it, but man, very, very nice beer. I'm going to go in for one more sip, see if I can pick apart this flavor profile. Yeah, little earthiness, little citrus, some fruitiness, little bit of pine in the back. Then there's this, it really does kind of remind me of like a cross between Kveik yeast and Brettanomyces, or almost like a lambic type. It almost tastes like there's some wild yeast in here, which maybe that's a function of that new hop blend. It's not something you often get in an IPA unless they intentionally brew it like that, but it's very good and it definitely pairs well. So for my money, the balance on this is great. The malt bill is classic IPA, but it doesn't get in the way of letting the hops be the star of the show, and they're all bringing something very unique to the table, not just in terms of flavor, but also in terms of aroma. This is a very good beer. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, count my scores. When we come back, we will get to the second beer of today's IPA review. That is the collaborative brew between Fort George and Grains of Wrath called Fanzine, and that one clocks in at 6.7% ABV. Okay, now jumping into the second beer of today's IPA review, we have got a collaboration between Fort George Brewing and Grains of Wrath. This one clocks in at 6.7% ABV. Fort George is the brewer of this specific one, even though it was a collab. They brewed it. They're based in Astoria, Oregon. So first thing first, Fanzine. Well, as it might imply, a magazine made by a fan. That is indeed what a fanzine is. You can see on there, they're kind of hearkening back to that. There's a little comic strip on this. I don't know how well. The camera may be picking it up. It's kind of light. It might get washed out. But there is a little comic strip on the label. Let's go ahead and get this one cracked. I can tell you, I could not find any information on the hop bill, so it's going to be going into this one with no expectations whatsoever. So let's just get this poured right in the glass. All right, pouring a nice classic IPA yellow color, true bright yellow. Pretty effervescent, looks like it's doing a good job forming a head here. And yet again, we're not quite going to get the whole thing in there, but that's okay. Visually, this is not cloudy at all. It is crystal clear. It's kind of a deep golden yellow color, true yellow. It's got a little mix of superfine champagne-like bubbles that I can see coming up from the middle and on the sides of the glass as you move closer to the sides of the glass. Kind of small to medium small, but not the super fine. It obviously did form quite a nice head here, as we can see quite clearly. Didn't get a big hint of aroma as I was cracking this or pouring it, so let's get right up over the glass, see what we get. Okay. It smells nice. It smells nice. It smells fresh. The aroma is not super pungent. You've got to get a pretty deep sniff on this one to really pick it out. And part of that could be the head is so thick and creamy and dense there. So I'm going to break a little bit down on the side just with my finger. See if I pick up anything a little more clearly. Yeah, just a little bit. What I'm getting is a slight fruitiness. There's a little bit of earthiness. And that's really the main aromas I'm picking up here. I'm not getting a ton of citrus. It smells more like tropical fruit and a little bit of earthiness. So I'm not sure exactly what hops might be in here. Could be an interesting blend. Don't really know what to expect in terms of bitters, but it does smell nice, albeit not a super pronounced aroma. But it looks great. Head is settled. Let's jump right in. Oh, that's very nice. That's very nice. Okay. My first impression was, while it smells very tropical fruit and kind of earthiness, the main profiles that are translated into the flavor itself is very much an earthiness. There's dominant earthy kind of hops here, but it's a lot more bitter than I anticipated. Certainly far more bitter than the first beer that we had in today's IPA review. It's got a nice earthy hoppiness to it. Just kind of a classic, what reminds me of British Fogle hops, but with more intensity of bitters. So I'm not sure exactly what hops they may have in here. Indeed, there could be some Fogle, but there's obviously a hop that's imparting these kind of tropical aromas, but I think it is indeed having had extracted more alphas into the base beer. It definitely has a much more pronounced bitter bite to it, which I quite enjoy. Very nice beer. Second thing I got to say, and this is pretty typical for IPAs that have a more earthy kind of hop back to them, is you do get a much greater sense of the malt bill. And it tends to pair more well with the base underlying malt bill when you use these kind of classic earthier hops. But there is a bigger intensity of bitters than you typically will expect or get with those classic kind of earthy flavored hops. With all the new strains with the high alpha acid contents, there's not a ton of them that have kind of that earthy profile. So it's possible they just used a big batch of something like an English Fogle hop. But yeah, it's very nice. It's got a nice clean bite to it. Definitely a good beer. And in terms of the malt bill, what's coming through, it's very clean. It tastes very grain-like, which obviously, yes, it's a beer, but that's the dominant kind of thing I'm left with here. It does taste grainy and earthy with a nice bitter kick. So all around, it's reminding me much more of, say, an American craft interpretation of what a classic English IPA might be, just with the bitters kind of turned up on the dial. Very nice, very clean beer. I'm going to go in again for body and mouthfeel, Explorer's finish. Body on this one is kind of bordering right smack in the middle of medium. Maybe medium light, but it's a little more towards medium. It doesn't feel heavy at all. Mouthfeel, this one feels kind of average as well. It's not super viscous, it's not super thin. It kind of body and mouthfeel on this feel right middle of the road, kind of smack in the Goldilocks zone for a 6.7 IPA. It's not bigger or smaller than I anticipated. It feels absolutely appropriate for the style. In terms of how this one finishes, not a suggestion of dryness in sight. It's very wet. I wouldn't call it round, but I would call it kind of wet and full to the end. It doesn't feel like it just escapes off the palate. You can still feel it kind of lingering around on there, and I don't just mean flavors, I mean the vestiges of the beer, albeit it isn't viscous per se, but it does kind of linger around the palate. And I could tell you on second sip, everything I got on first sip was really intensified. So the bitters come through even more clearly on subsequent sips. I'm guessing that that's going to progressively increase the intensity with each subsequent sip as well. But it's very nice. In terms of balance, the balance on this, obviously IPA, I think the hop is the star of the show. I think they nailed it here. But their hop choice also does let the malt bill shine through in this beer, and the balance between the two is fantastic. The hops are still front and center, but you do, if you're really paying attention to what you're tasting and experiencing, you absolutely can pick out the malt bill. That for me is the definition of a well-balanced IPA. Overall, I really enjoy this one. I'm going to take my time, sip on this, count my scores. When we come back, we will get both beers ranked from top to bottom. Okay, now that we've gotten to enjoy both beers, we're going to get them ranked, starting with new Image Brewing's Bio-T. 6.5% ABV on this one. They're based in Arvada, California, and this was brewed with a blend of Bio-T, their new experimental hop, as well as Citra and Motueka. Starting with the aroma. The aroma on this was fantastic. There was a ton of different classic hop aromas that were in there. And, you know, really the pungency level on this was quite nice. It also smelled very, very fresh, very bright, just a really nice, pleasing aroma with plenty of pungency. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the taste, overall, I did really enjoy the taste. Layers of flavor, a lot of different classic hop characteristics that came through in the flavor profile. And certainly in that respect, I thought that it was well above average, but where it kind of backslid a little bit for me was just the overall lack of pungency in terms of bitters. IPAs are a star of the hops. Hops, you know, the bittering agent. That's how the style was born. That's kind of its thing. So I totally appreciate there's different ways to go about it. And don't get me wrong, this did taste fantastic. Had a ton of the interesting hop flavors brought to the table. It just didn't pack the bitter punch for me. But still delicious. It is above average. It gets a 7 out of 10. For the body. The body on this one was really just kind of middle in the road for an IPA in this, you know, ABV range. At 6.5, that's a little lower than kind of the 7% Goldilocks zone you see in most modern IPAs. But still, the body really was just kind of medium, maybe even bordering on medium light. It gets average 5 out of 10. The mouthfeel, on the other hand, was a completely different story. For a 6.5% ABV, honestly, yes, it was certainly kind of in that range of what I expected for the ABV range, but it had quite a bit more resistance. So it felt like an IPA should on the palate, but it was quite a bit more resistant than I did anticipate. In this respect, it was above average. It gets an 8 out of 10. For the finish. The finish on this beer was, again, just another average category score. For me, I appreciated the flavors I got, and it really was delicious on every sip that I had, but it just didn't have the staying power that I expect from an IPA. This one really, I think the lack of bitter pungency and presence in the beer really did it a disservice there. So sure, it tasted good. The finish was fine in terms of textural experience, but there was really no length on the end of it, so to speak. And it does come up average here. It gets a 5 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one did a fantastic job. Easily could have been poured off of a tap. It gets a perfect 10 out of 10. The appearance, same story. This was textbook IPA yellow. Exactly what I picture in my head when I think of an IPA. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance. Now, I'm separating hop bitters from the actual balance of the base ingredients of the beer. The hops they chose, and the malt bill. And they all came through very clearly. All of the individual hop characteristics came through in the flavor as well as the aroma, of course. But this one, you could also really taste that underlying malt bill. And it was just balanced beautifully. And yes, the hops in this, despite lacking noticeable bitters, were still the star of the show. It was just different characteristics of the hop. But you could absolutely still pick out a very delicious malt bill. That, to me, is the epitome of how to balance a beer. Whether or not it's lacking or more intense on a specific aspect, That's the balance. You want to strike that balance between the ingredients to be able to pick them all out. This did a great job. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Overall, I did enjoy this beer. I thought that in terms of an IPA, it was above average. For me, it just needed more bitters to really kick it up a notch. IPAs are a crowded marketplace. There's tons of options out there. If you really want to stand out, you can't just make some new iteration of something that there's already hundreds of out in the marketplace. And that's not really a criticism, it's just a really more of a statement of realism here. It's just the way that it is. But above average subjectively for me. It gets a 7 out of 10. Finally, as an example of the style. Overall, I enjoyed the beer. It did very well in quite a few categories. Some it absolutely nailed. Others it really just kind of hovered in the average range. And for me, I'll come back to this, what I just said. You know, really in a crowded marketplace for IPAs, you can't just have a run-of-the-mill offering. And I'm not suggesting it isn't. It is rather, and certainly using this experimental hop, that's awesome. Great idea. I like what they were doing here. It just didn't have that certain it or wow factor for me that I would say, yeah, this is one I would grab again over something else. I don't think that I would. Not to say I'm not glad that I got to try it. I always am to try a new beer. But for me, it was just high end of average overall. Example of style gets a 6 out of 10, which brings the total score on New Image Brewing's Bio T to a 78 out of 100. Moving on to beer number 2, this is the collaborative brew between Fort George and Grains of Wrath. This one's called Fanzine, clocked in at 6.7% ABV, and they are based in Astoria, Oregon. So for the aroma, this doesn't happen often, but it can, of beers of any style, but this was one you had to really give a pretty pronounced and deliberate sniff to get an idea of what was coming out of that glass. Even when I agitated it and, you know, shut the head down a little bit just to make sure that wasn't stopping the aroma from coming up, it really wasn't that pronounced. What I could pick up smelled nice, just in terms of overall aroma pungency, getting the palate ready for what's to come. It was just low end of average for me. It gets a 4 out of 10. For the taste on this one was really, really nice. Overall, I don't know what the hop blend was, but there was definitely some special something in this one. Noticeably more bitter forward than the first beer. Not that we're drawing direct comparisons here, but that does go a long way to the overall experience of an IPA for me. Taste, 9 out of 10. For the body on this one, kind of similar story to the first. It felt appropriate for the ABV range, but it didn't wow me. It was just basically right where I thought that it would be. It had the right amount of body for the ABV and for the style, so it was very much average. It does get a 5 out of 10. For the mouthfeel. Mouthfeel on this one, similar story, only it was noticeably less resistant than the first beer. This had a slightly larger ABV on it, and certainly the body and the mouthfeel felt like they were in parity, but they were both a little more subdued than I would like to see on an IPA that's kind of setting itself apart from the rest. Yet again, another average score here. It gets a 5 out of 10. For the finish on this one was quite long. And really for me, and I'm positive of this, what did it was the lingering bitters. Sure, the flavors were great in both beers and definitely different in both beers, and they both had something a little unique to them that maybe you would prefer one over the other. But when it comes down to it, the finish on an IPA, what's going to really let those flavors linger around, it is going to be the alpha acid extraction, which means more bitters present in the beer, and that was the story here. This did a great job. It gets a 10 out of 10. For the head and retention, this one was just like the first beer, just a beautiful pour, beautiful head, 10 out of 10. For the appearance, while this one was just a little bit more intense of a shade, they both fell right in that classic. That's the hue I think of when I think of an IPA. Appearance gets a 10 out of 10. For the balance on this one was exceptional. It was another one of these, and of course, like I said, they're both very different, but what they did in terms of balance was the same formula. You could taste all the individual hops, all the characteristics they brought to the table, plenty of bitters in this one, but you could also still taste that underlying malt bill, and you know, that's just a thing of beauty. That's how to do it. They nailed it. It gets a 10 out of 10. Feeling in the intangible. Subjectively on this one, I really enjoyed it. I did think that it was well above average. For what it was it had some interesting and unique characteristics it brought to the table. Not something you find in an IPA every day. As a hophead, yeah, I'm always craving more bitters, but I thought this one did do a good job balancing out different characteristics and intensities. Overall, gets an 8 out of 10 from me. Finally, as an example of the style. Overall, this beer did pretty well. A few categories it just kind of hovered in the average range, just like the first one. But overall, as a total package, I thought for an IPA this was above average in a very crowded marketplace. It gets a 7 out of 10, which brings the total score on Fort George's collaboration with Grains of Wrath, Fanzine, to a 78 out of 100. So different approaches, different beer drinking experiences, but they both ended up with the same score. Depending on what you're into, these are easily two distinctly different IPAs for different palates. If you don't like tons of bitters and you just want to taste all those fruity accents and kind of earthy accents that the hops can bring to the table, this is the one I would recommend. If you like a hoppier, more bitter forward kick with some also interesting notes, this is the one I'd go for. Folks, that's today's review. As always, I do sincerely appreciate you tuning in today. Please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. And if you want to stay in the loop when our videos go live to YouTube, you can just click the notification bell icon. It's right next to the subscribe button. Until next time, keep it beer, keep it craft. We'll see you on the next one. Cheers.